Welcome, everyone. We're glad to have you here with us this evening for our webinar, Sleep, Myths and Truths. My name is Beth Keene, and I am the Community Chair for the Heart, Health, and Wellness Council at Newton-Wellesley Hospital. Tonight's webinar is sponsored by the Heart, Health, and Wellness Council, one of 8 councils that make up the Newton-Wellesley Hospital Community Collaborative. I'd just like to take a quick minute to describe the collaborative and its councils because they are an amazing component of what Newton-Wellesley Hospital's efforts are with community outreach. The community collaborative was formed to improve the health and wellness of those who live in the area the hospital serves by enhancing health education, health services, and health resources throughout our local communities. The 8 councils within the collaborative are responsible for a variety of initiatives, all with compelling impact. The councils champion different areas of healthcare, prevention, and intervention to make a real difference in the cities and towns in which we live and work. The areas they focus on primarily, these councils, are domestic and sexual abuse, elder care, heart health and wellness, maternity services, palliative care services, substance use, workforce development, and youth mental health. The Community Collaborative is a philanthropy-driven initiative dependent upon the generosity of supporters and viewers like you to help us continue to expand our wide range of services and offerings in our communities. Currently, we're in the process of updating our presence, the collaborative's presence on the Newton-Wellesley Hospital website. That's nwh.org. And I hope you find time in the near future to seek out the collaborative on nwh.org because there's a lot that we're going to put out there regarding initiatives the collaborative has underway, specifics about the different councils and what they're working on, things that are upcoming, things that have happened in the past. And it's also a way that you will be able to, maybe get involved, offer up your time, your talent, or your treasure. Yes, there is a donate button. So keep your eyes open for that coming soon. In the meantime, I would encourage you to take a look at the Newton-Wellesley YouTube channel. You can Google it, Newton-Wellesley YouTube channel. And within that, there is a community collaborative section that hosts a lot of dozens of these webinar recordings under community events. And it's a great library, a great resource that's free and available all the time for informative sessions on all kinds of health issues. So I encourage you to explore that channel for your own education and maybe for, as a great way to share some good information with people you care about. If you have any questions about the collaborative or the councils, I would encourage you to just pop a little note in the chat here on the Zoom screen, and someone will get back to you and maybe get you involved somehow. It'd be great. I'd like to make a little shout out to the Heart, Health, and Wellness Council. Our primary focus is to reach out to diverse populations to promote preventive health. We do this through community-based education and hands-on programming, and we encourage fitness, nutrition, and stress management as a way to reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease and all other chronic illnesses. This lifestyle medicine, of which, quite honestly, quality sleep is a huge component, is something we can all, as individuals, focus on to improve our own personal health and hopefully keep us out of the hospital. All right, I would like to just explain a few things before we get started. Maybe get a pen and some paper or open up a new window on whatever device you're watching on this evening. There's going to be a lot of good information and you may want to take some notes. Yeah, we have dedicated a section of time at the end of the presentation for live question and answer with our presenters. So you may have already arrived this evening with some questions about sleep. You may think of some questions as you listen. So please take advantage of the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at the bottom there to type in any questions you may have. We will hopefully get to as many of them as we can by the end of our webinar session this evening. Also, want you to know that if you have registered for this event, you will be receiving the materials and a recording of the presentation next week. So you can sit back and relax and enjoy the show, right? And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce this evening's presenters, Drs. Kadar and Mizra. Dr. Kadar grew up in Wayland, Massachusetts. He attended Dartmouth College and studied literature and creative writing in addition to his pre-med work. He then received his medical and master's degrees in public health at Tulane University. He completed his internal medicine residency, where he was also chief resident, at Rush Medical Center in Chicago. He then returned home to Boston for fellowship training in pulmonary and critical care medicine at Boston Medical Center. After an additional fellowship in sleep medicine at Leahy Health, he began working at Newton-Wellesley in 2006. He currently serves as the Newton-Wellesley Medical Director of the Intensive Care Unit and is Chief of the Division of Pulmonary and Critical Care Medicine. Dr. Kadar lives in Needham with his wife, Jess, and their 2 children. Our second presenter this evening is Dr. Mizra, a Massachusetts native. He attended the Johns Hopkins University, earning degrees in biomedical engineering and material science, followed by a PhD in biomedical engineering, as well as his medical doctorate from Drexel University in Philadelphia. He completed both internship and residency at the Harvard Mass General Brigham and Women's Hospital, followed by clinical fellowships in neurophysiology and epilepsy at Mass General. He started working at Newton-Wellesley Hospital in 2022, where he is currently a board-certified epileptologist and general neurologist. Dr. Mizra lives in Sudbury with his wife, Jessica. I expect tonight's program will be riveting, but given the topic, if by some chance you nod off, we will also consider that a success. All right, please take it away, Dr. Kadar.
Great, thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. I'm glad to see how many people had signed up to listen to this topic. It's an interesting topic and relevant to a lot of us. So I think if we can go to the first slide. Perfect. All right, so I'm going to start off giving a little bit of background, historical background about sleep. What we're looking at is a picture, a painting from the 19th century. A painting at the very left of the screen is the goddess Nyx and her son Hypnos. Hypnos is the one scattering flowers over the field. Those are poppies. And so even in the 19th century, there was a sense of sleep as almost like a drugged-like state. And in the 19th century, laudanum, which is an opium derivative, was frequently used as a sleep aid. And then at the very bottom of the screen, there's a river running through it. That's the river Lethe, which was a river in Greek mythology in the underworld that was associated with the clearing of memory, which we'll come back to, as there are interactions between sleep and memory processing. And in mythology, sleep had been treated almost as a similar state to kind of a reversible coma-like state. If you think of like Sleeping Beauty, for example, where they trade death for a permanent sleep state. Next slide. So here we're looking at Hippocrates, and the early Greeks had conceptions of sleep as being a consequence of some of the effects of the bodily humors. And Hippocrates felt like, at night, more of the humors concentrated in the chest, and that caused a reduction in consciousness. Aristotle had a sense that at night, some of the humors were cooling the brain, and that was causing sleep. Next slide. This is Queen Victoria, and in the Victorian age, there was more of a behavioral conception of sleep. The Victorians felt that because there was less activity, less social interaction at night, that in the absence of light, in the absence of activity and interaction, that people consequently were more likely to sleep. Next slide. This is a picture of Pierron, who was a French neurophysiologist. And now some of his work starts to bring us into a more modern era of conceptions of sleep. Pierron introduced the concept of a hypnotoxin. His idea was that the longer one is awake, the more that substance builds up in the brain and creates a greater drive to sleep. And that is part of the story. It's not the whole story. That hypnotoxin eventually was felt to best compared to adenosine, which is a neurotransmitter that builds up the longer we're awake and is reduced in the central nervous system as we sleep. Adenosine is relative to a lot of us because caffeine blocks the soporific or sedentary effects of adenosine transiently. So most of us use caffeine in one form or another to help feel more awake, and that's blocking the effects of adenosine, which was the hypnotoxin he had identified. Next slide. If anyone has ever stayed up all night long, you know that hypnotoxin theory of medicine can't be the entire story, right? So the experience, the sort of lived experience of staying up all night long, which might be sort of fun when you're 15 or 16, and probably for most of us is now a form of torture. But the idea is, like, if you're staying up all night long, you get sleepier and sleepier. 2 or 3 in the morning is going to be a very difficult time to maintain wakefulness. But it's not a complete straight line. You don't just keep getting more and more tired, right? When you make it to 6 or 7 in the morning, most people will experience a bit of a second wind. And that's a great example of the other mechanism that's influencing sleep, the circadian system in our body, which causes 2 peaks of drowsiness. Most of us feel a dip in the level of alertness in the afternoon around 2 or 3 in the morning, and another one around 2 or 3 in the morning. So initially, when you go to sleep, you've built up adenosine, and that what's called the homeostatic drive helps you fall asleep and helps you stay asleep in the first half of the night. During the second half of the night, your circadian system, or your biological clock, kicks in and helps keep you asleep. Once 7 or 8 a.m. roll around, and this varies from person to person. Some people are more night owls, some people are more morning people, but in the morning, eventually that circadian dip in alertness wears off. Or another way of looking at it is that you get a second wind or a burst in alertness. And so even without sleeping, many people will get that second wind, and then if you continue to stay awake by the afternoon, really feel it. So that shows sort of the 2 competing systems that are involved in maintaining sleep. Hans Berger was credited with being one of the first to measure the electrical activity on the surface of the brain, what we think of as an EEG. And his recordings really opened the door to a lot of the modern conception of sleep stages and sleep research. Next slide. So here, what I want to do is take you through how we think of some of the normal stages of sleep. Hopefully, most of us are awake up at the top here, and the activity there shows sort of variable frequencies. There's a lot of different things happening in different parts of the brain, and so we're not seeing any kind of coordinated slow waves. If you become drowsy, if you shut your eyes, for many people, if they get into a meditative state, will then get into sort of a slower and slightly more discrete pattern of alpha waves. That's shown under the drowsy category there. And there was an experiment that was done at the Brigham years ago, over a decade ago, where they attached interns to an ambulatory EEG recording for 24 hours. These were interns that were on call overnight for at least 24 hours. So they'd been awake for over 24 hours. And one of the things that was interesting to note was that on rounds in the morning, they would see that some of the interns, even though they were on their feet and they were, answering questions, at times when they were quiet, they would have these dips where they would go from alpha waves into what are called theta waves, into stage 1 sleep. And stage one sleep is a very light sleep. It's a very kind of transitional state. If you ever had a long blink, or if you're in a lecture and you just start to nod off, that's the entry into sleep. Some of these sleep deprived interns were very briefly going into so-called micro sleeps, where they would drop into that stage one for a few seconds at a time. And presumably some of these can be what accounts for, there are accidents on the highway, for example, where people are sleep deprived, and Dr. Misra will talk a little bit more about sleep deprivation later in the talk. But if you have one of these micro sleep episodes where you just have a long blink, a dip in your level of alertness, that could be enough time for a lane change. So it's not always when people are in bed that they drop into these kind of stages of sleep. Stage two is a deeper stage of sleep. It's not the deepest, but it's what most of us would reach. If you were to take a nap, say for 20 or 30 minutes, you probably would end up getting into stage two sleep, and you're now less aware of the environment around you, significantly less aware of the environment around you. But the threshold to wake somebody up from stage two would not be as intense as what we see below, delta sleep, which is also called deep sleep or slow wave sleep. Here you could see that the activity of the brain is very coordinated and slow. And in a very rough way, you can think that the slower these waves are happening, the more deeply unconscious you are. Delta, if you think of, 9-year-olds are some of the best sleepers, that we see. They have boundless energy all day long, and then they go to sleep and sleep 10 hours, and they sleep deeply. For those of you that have had children, that you can pick up an 8 or 9-year-old while they're sleeping and move them, and they don't wake up. There was a very small study out of the UK where they looked to see how many kids woke up when exposed to the sound of a smoke alarm, and about 80% of them were able to sleep through a smoke detector, as opposed to, I'm sure many of us on this call, wake up if our bed partner breathes loudly enough. So there's there's a real depth and resistance to waking up in this deepest of sleep. At the bottom is REM sleep, and REM sleep is very different from all these. All these other stages are considered non-REM sleep. REM sleep has a pattern of activity that is most similar to the pattern that we see at the very top when we're awake. And an interesting phenomenon in REM sleep, if you wake up out of REM sleep, the brain sort of is online already. It's using similar amounts of energy to what we use when we're awake. And I think a common experience that people will have is waking up at some point before the alarm clock and feeling relatively awake, but knowing that you have some more time to sleep, and then returning to sleep, and then 30 minutes later when the alarm goes off, you feel more tired for the extra sleep. Well, what happened there? So if you wake up out of REM sleep when we have the most complex dreams and the brain is already activated in many ways, it becomes easier to feel wide awake. When you wake up out of some of these other stages of sleep, in particular deep sleep, it takes the brain some time to fully come online, and there's going to be more of a sense of drowsiness until you do come more fully awake. Let's see, next slide, please. This is what we call a hypnogram, and this is showing the so-called architecture of sleep over the course of the night. And what you can see is at the very beginning, we're awake, and then you enter sleep through stage one and progressively go through stage two. And this is an older graph that shows stage 3 and 4, which are sort of lumped together now, both representing slow wave sleep. What you can see here is that in the first half of the night, during the first 4 hours, you see significantly more slow wave sleep than you do REM sleep. And that slow wave sleep is really driven more by the amount of sleepiness that you bring, the accumulated hypnotoxin or adenosine. And for most of us, we're in some ballpark awake for 16 hours and asleep for somewhere around 8 hours. That wakefulness beforehand is driving the sleep in the first half of the night. The second half of the night is where you see a higher concentration of REM sleep. If you look in the red, you can see that there's a greater representation, typically of REM sleep. In particular, right near the waking hours. Many of us are in REM sleep and having more complex dreams right before that alarm clock goes off, and towards the end of our sleep period. The other thing that this sleep architecture shows that may be relevant for those of you that have perhaps looked at wearables or looked at your own sleep architecture in a simpler way from an Apple Watch, say, is that people will see arousals that can sometimes come right after what's called a sleep period. And a sleep period is defined as uh, generally a stretch of stage 1 to slow wave sleep and then a period of REM. And that can last generally anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes. And it's very typical to have arousals after one of those sleep periods. And we would most often have 3 or 4 of those sleep periods over the course of the night. So it doesn't necessarily mean that anything is wrong. People often wake up, change positions, go back to sleep, often without even remembering doing so. Next slide. So if we think about what is normal sleep, it's a reversible state of unconsciousness. It's now well understood not to be a passive or death-like state, but it's a very active process. There are different biological functions that are at higher or lower activity during some of these stages. It's not homogeneous. So for many years, people considered sleep just to be this blank state that would occur overnight. But again, I think if you've had children and you've seen that they very clearly are more active during certain parts of the night than others, uh, and we know now with EEG data that there are these different stages of sleep with different electrical activity of the brain, and that sleep is under both homeostatic, the buildup of adenosine or the hypnotoxin, and circadian control, that sense of a biological clock. Next slide. This is a picture of Nathaniel Kleitman, who was a very prominent early researcher active at the University of Chicago. And when he lectured, often people would ask, what is sleep for? What's the purpose of sleep? And for some reason, that question bothered him. And he often would answer it, challenging people to explain what the purpose of being awake is for. But I think it's a fair question. I mean, it's most of us, not most of us, all of us require anywhere from 6 to 9 hours a night, usually somewhere around 7 hours. And there has to be some compelling biological reason that we see this period of restfulness and sleep in basically every species. Next slide. So there are a variety of different theories. If you look at sleep in different species, small animals that tend to have higher metabolic rates usually sleep much more, whereas large animals like elephants with a much slower metabolic rate tend to sleep much less. So you have some small mammals that might sleep as much as 20 hours in a given day. Cats often sleep more than 16 hours in a given day. Whereas like giraffes and elephants will sleep more like 3 or 4 hours in a day. People have looked at the evolutionary drivers of sleep, and that the drive to be in a protected space and inactive at night may help avoid certain predators. We also see differences in sleep based on the amount of cortex. The cortex is the part of the brain that we most associate with personality and higher level thought, as opposed to more reflexive type activities. So mammals tend to have much more REM sleep than reptiles do, where reptiles don't have the same degree of cortical development. Obviously, sleep serves as a time to allow upregulation of restorative processes, both physical and mental. In particular, children have some of the most slow wave sleep, where we see some of the highest levels of growth hormones. So growing children tend to have a ton of slow wave sleep, and really by the age of around 20 or so, what we start to see is a reduction and then a plateau by the time you get to about 40 or so of how much slow wave sleep you have. REM sleep stays pretty constant throughout later in childhood. We see a ton of REM sleep during very young ages in infancy, but for beyond toddlers into adulthood, most people have around 20 or 25% of the night in REM sleep. REM sleep also seems to be strongly related to memory and information processing. When you learn new information, many people will have an uptick in the amount of REM sleep that they experience that night. So, depending on how much you absorb from today's talk, you may have some more REM sleep tonight. Next slide. I mean, the short answer is really nobody knows what the purpose of it is. I think that for many sleep researchers now, the idea of sleep being integral to restorative processes, memory processing, processing of new information, is what is most frequently talked about. Next slide. There are also more obvious answers from what happens with sleep deprivation. Again, Dr. Mishra will talk a little bit more about consequences of sleep deprivation, so I won't dwell on that. And we know that it's critical to the development of the brain, and it's critical to forming new memories and establishing information in memory, in longer term memory. Next. The question often comes up, and I get asked this a lot in the office: how much sleep should I get? And I would just preface this by saying that most of the time when we try to answer this, two things come to mind. I think a lot of people have in mind that everybody needs 8 hours, which is a result of a marketing campaign by the National Sleep Foundation. I think evidence would suggest that, well, one is that people are different, right? There are some people that need less sleep, some people that need more sleep, and that exists on a curve, a distribution curve, and that curve sort of clusters around about seven hours. This was a prominent study that was a survey of a large population looking at how much people slept. So this was self-reported sleep. And what I would take away from this is that if you look at significantly less than 7 hours or significantly more than 7 hours, you start seeing an increase in the hazard ratio for mortality. And this same kind of a graph exists for a lot of other outcomes. What it doesn't capture is why are people getting too much sleep or not enough sleep. That's a complex issue. And obviously tells us nothing about individual genetics that might also inform how much one needs to sleep. But in general, it's around 7 hours plus or minus. Next slide. So some people have argued that in modern society where we have access to artificial light and most of us have a phone and many of us take that phone to the bedroom, that exposure to light can cause some degree of sleep deprivation. And certainly we are sensitive to light. It can affect our circadian clocks. This was an interesting study where they took basically the equivalent of a Fitbit. They took a device that has an accelerometer, and they convinced 3 different pre-industrial groups. So the Hadza in Tanzania, the San in Namibia, and the Tsimane in Bolivia. And they watched what happened over the period of a year. And what you can see here is the blue is giving you a sense of like on average when people were sleeping. And they're showing different times of year. And there were a couple of things that were interesting here. On average, people slept 6.5 to 7 hours. They spent about 7.5 or 8 hours in bed. They did not find evidence that, under natural, quote unquote, natural conditions, that people were taking any kind of a siesta or napping in the middle of the day. That did not seem to be the case. Next slide. I want to touch briefly on 2 of the most common areas that are disruptors of sleep. Next slide. The first is sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea, which is a disease that gained a tremendous importance once we had more readily available treatments for it. So CPAP, continuous positive airway pressure, was developed first around 1980 and has really grown tremendously since then. Sleep apnea is relatively prevalent. It's about as common as diabetes, and what it involves is If you think of snoring, many of us snore, and snoring involves vibrating of tissues, typically in the back of the throat, the uvula, which is the end of the soft palate, or the base of the tongue against the back of the throat. In sleep apnea, what happens, we can go to the next slide, is that the tongue and that uvula rest against the back of the throat and don't move out of the way appropriately when somebody's making an inspiratory effort. And so as a result, you have a reduction in airflow or a complete cessation in airflow, although the chest is still rising and falling and the person is attempting to breathe. That leads to an arousal from sleep, which restores some tone to those muscles and causes the person then to take a few breaths. And it gives you a little burst of adrenaline in the middle of the night when really you should be obviously resting and in a relaxed state. And instead your body responds as if to a miniature crisis. And this can happen with great frequency. Normally people will have fewer than 5 events an hour like this. But it's not uncommon for us to see people that are having 40, 50, 60 events per hour. So their sleep is going to be highly fragmented and broken up into many small pieces and significantly less restorative. Next slide. So insomnia is a big topic. It could be a talk all unto itself. And we think of insomnia as difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep throughout the night with some sort of a daytime consequence, sleepiness, alteration in mood, cognition. And although insomnia is treated as a diagnosis, I think it's better understood as a symptom. If you think of a fever can come about for all sorts of different reasons, various different infections, drug reactions, and so the inevitable question is, are pills good for insomnia? And it's in many ways like asking, is Tylenol good for a fever? It really, what is that fever coming from? Do we understand what has driven that? And it's helpful to understand some of the subtypes of insomnia. Adjustment insomnia is something that I'm sure all of us have experienced, which is difficulty getting to sleep or staying asleep in response to a transient stress. Psychophysiological insomnia is what happens when that turns into a more prolonged pattern of poor sleep, when the stressor is gone, but the pattern of maladaptive sleep remains. Idiopathic insomnia reflects people with a certain genetic driver towards difficulty sleeping and have often had struggles with sleep since they were young children. Environmental disorders, this is most relevant. If your spouse snores, that's going to keep people up. What we see a lot of in an older population are cases of insomnia as a result of underlying medical issues, whether it's chronic pain, underlying heart disease, lung disease that may interfere with getting consistent restful sleep. And of course, underlying psychiatric conditions like depression or anxiety will also have manifestations on sleep. So I'm going to stop here and hand the talk over to Dr. Misra, who will continue to discuss some of the consequences of what happens if we don't get adequate sleep.
Okay, awesome. So now that we have that wonderful background as to what sleep is, we can start to talk about what the body's manifestations are for when we're exhibiting a lack of sleep or insufficient sleep. Let's just move here. So I think the first and biggest take-home point is that sleep deprivation really will affect all systems of the body. So it's not just your brain, it's not just your cognition. Really, every single physiologic system in the body has some degree of impact when it's sleep deprived. And that really brings, it goes all the way down to the genetic level. So as we talked about previously, sleep itself is mediated both with kind of somatic hypnotoxin type mediators for sleep, like the buildup of adenosine, but there's also the circadian rhythm that helps dictate your daily activity cycle. And we actually see that sleep has a direct impact on how that circadian rhythm is set up. There are genes that are in the body that are actually systemically activated or deactivated to modulate your circadian rhythm based off of the amount of sleep that you get. Similarly, as Dr. Gadar mentioned, Memory systems are particularly affected by sleep in general, and part of the way that the brain works in terms of consolidating memory is through something called long-term potentiation, and that's essentially the abilities of the brain's networks to facilitate and reinforce certain pathways, and so that you can reinforce certain memories. And part of that reinforcement involves increases in gene expressions and changes in the surface proteins and surface receptors in the memory networks to help facilitate encoding of those memories. And the other kind of big area in the genetic world that's of particular importance clinically for our patient populations here is inflammation, and inflammation specifically as it relates to things like atherosclerosis. There are specific genes like the MER and CRK genes which mediate inflammatory processes, specifically vascular inflammatory processes. And you can see upregulation in some of these genes facilitating atherosclerotic buildup. So you actually get worsening atherosclerotic plaques in your blood vessels as a result of changes in gene expression from sleep deprivation. And that has direct impact on your cardiovascular health. It increases your risk for stroke. It increases your risk for heart attacks. You'll see kind of fundamental changes in your body's function just from sleep deprivation. On a more macroscopic scale, each of the various systems tends to have a constellation of changes that are associated with sleep deprivation. The cardiovascular system, we already know about the atherosclerosis, but what we see in people who are chronically sleep deprived, consistently, they are measured to have elevated heart rates. They're measured to have elevated blood pressures. So blood pressures, increase in about at a factor of about 1.2. So about 20% increase in blood pressures in people who are chronically sleep deprived as compared to healthy controls. So significant. Sympathetic tone. So sympathetic tone refers to your fight or flight response. It's the thing that dictates how fast your heart rate is, how much your blood is pumping, how much blood pressure you're generating. And part of that changes with sleep function. Like Dr. Goddard mentioned, there is a recovery aspect of sleep. And from a cardiovascular perspective, what we see often, especially during the REM stages of sleep, is a dip in sympathetic tone. You have a kind of a rescue from the normal amounts of epinephrine that are kind of driving your normal activity, and that is associated with lower heart rates during sleep, lower blood pressures during sleep, kind of lowering the overall average heart rate and blood pressure that you're experiencing over the day. In cases of patients with sleep deprivation, you see that you lose that REM dip, so to speak. It's you no longer have that respite from your sympathetic tone, and your average pressures and heart rates will go up. Similarly, there's a built-in system in your body responsible for maintaining tone of your vasculature, for dilating and constricting. And part of that dilation is mediated by a chemical called nitric oxide, and that nitric oxide vasodilatory system is impaired in sleep deprivation as well, and that can have direct consequences for a variety of different things, including heart health, kidney health, and even sexual function. In terms of respiratory symptoms that are associated with sleep deprivation, we saw that during sleep, especially with sleep apnea, there is a physical restriction in the ability to ventilate, but there's also a central system that is built in from your brainstem that drives your need to breathe and keep your body oxygenated. And in chronic sleep deprivation, we see that respiratory drive from the brainstem is blunted. And in addition to that, the actual ability for you to generate inspiratory force, to take in a deep breath and help facilitate that oxygenation, is also blunted. So you see a decrease in drive to breathe and also a decrease in inspiratory force, making it overall much more difficult to get your body oxygenated in the way that it needs to be. The other thing, and this is going to be a common pattern across systems, is that sleep deprivation can be associated with worsening of chronic medical conditions. So in case of the respiratory system, asthma, which is a reactive airway disease, where the airways are not able to open up wide enough to help facilitate breathing, that can actually be exacerbated with chronic sleep deprivation by mediating the immune system and activating immune cells that are causing inflammation and causing airway constriction. In the gastrointestinal system, we see changes in mucosal inflammation and in fatty liver disease, those levels going up in sleep-deprived patients. In the endocrine system, we see impaired ability to maintain your body temperature. We see increased insulin resistance, which leads to increased diabetes. And then also changes in your drive to eat because of that. It increases substances that help drive your appetite and decreases your sensors for satiety or fullness. And that combination can lead to increased food intake, obesity, and elevated levels of your LDL or bad cholesterol. In terms of the immune impacts, people who are sleep deprived are known to be more susceptible to pneumonias and upper respiratory infections. And actually, quantitatively, if you look at immune function, the natural killer and T cells, which are responsible for fighting off infections, they've shown objective decreases in functionality up to 30%. So considerable impact to your immune and your immune defenses. The genitourinary system, there are increases in urine production, there's associated sexual dysfunction, low testosterone levels, and possible associated increases with prostate cancer. And in terms of cancer in general, there is direct correlation between patients who experience less than 6 hours of sleep a night and levels of breast cancer and colorectal cancer. So you can see there are a lot of different impacts where we have sleep deprivation across various body systems. Nothing is spared. But the bulk of the area that's interesting to me as a neurologist is brain dysfunction. And this is where a lot of symptomatology that kind of gets overlooked really lies. So what we know is that in sleep, the area of the brain that's particularly affected is the prefrontal cortex. This is the front part of your brain. This is responsible for your working memory, your executive function, and your attention. So that's your ability to focus, your ability to keep things in your memory for a short enough time to manipulate that data. So that's like misplacing your keys, remembering a list of directions, maybe in following a recipe, things like that. And the big aspect of this that people tend to experience is these attentional lapses. And this goes back to what Dr. Gadar was mentioning with these microsleeps, where you have anywhere between half a second and 10-second changes into stage 1 sleep, where you're not able to pay attention, you're not able to take information in, and so that information is no longer available for you to manipulate in the future, and can be responsible for lapses in your ability to follow sequential tasks, lapses in your ability to focus on topics. And this kind of dysfunction appears to be linearly dependent on the amount of sleep. So the more sleep deprivation you have, the more dysfunction you have in this area. Interestingly, a lot of time patients are not aware of the deficits, and it's actually family members or friends who tell them that they're not themselves. They're not focusing. They're seemingly lapsing in attention. Their memory is deteriorating. And to kind of give you a benchmark for understanding exactly how much impairment you have, they've done kind of comparative studies in terms of attentional effects of prolonged wakefulness. And what they've shown is that 17 hours of prolonged wakefulness, if you think about it, that's like basically a normal day, right? That's 7 hours of sleep, 17 hours of wakefulness. That is equivalent to a blood alcohol level of 0.05 in terms of your ability to focus on attention type tasks. So it can be quite significant, even with amounts of sleep that we expect to be essentially normal. So there are a bunch of different systems in the brain that are affected specifically, and I'll talk about a couple of them and how they impact on various pathologies. The first one is the glymphatic system. This is the system that's responsible for clearing away toxins. Toxins like the adenosine that Dr. Gadar had mentioned, that kind of is a way for the brain to experience fatigue. And one of the things that we see is that during sleep, the amount of CSF flow or clearance of these toxins increases by a factor of 2.5. So a large chunk of your brain's ability to clear away toxins occurs during sleep. So lack of sleep limits that toxin clearance. So what are the toxins that are limited in clearance? Well, adenosine is one of them, and that's kind of responsible for how awake people feel. But there are other proteins like beta amyloid, tau, and alpha-synuclein. These are associated with neurodegenerative diseases, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But the buildup of these can cause neuron damage and ultimately things like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Other main symptoms that people kind of experience with sleep deprivation is amplification of pain. There's good data to suggest that there's decreased pain tolerance and increased pain sensitivity in patients who have sleep deprivation. And this is a study that was done comparing two populations, one undergoing normal habitual sleep, like the regular amount of sleep, and the gray people who had extended amounts of sleep, a couple of extra hours a night. And they compared how long it would take for them to withdraw from a hot plate. That's a painful stimulus. And what they showed was on day one, when everything was relatively equal, there was a pretty standard withdrawal time. But on day four, consistently having extra sleep caused people to allow their fingers to stay on the painful stimulus for a longer period of time, up to 30% longer. And that is a reflection of the fact that there's that increase in pain tolerance and lower pain threshold, or increased pain threshold in people who get more sleep. So people who are chronic pain sufferers, poor sleep quality can in fact exacerbate and worsen that experience. In terms of other major neurologic diseases, stroke, we see sleep deprivation in not only increasing rates of atherosclerosis, which is a risk factor for stroke, but it also increases the expression of proteins that inhibit growth and recovery and increases the expression of proteins that increase inflammation. So not only does sleep deprivation cause an increase in the likelihood of stroke, it also decreases your ability to recover from stroke after you've had one. In terms of other diseases, epilepsy, we know that epilepsy is oftentimes associated with sleep deprivation as a trigger. Seizures tend to happen during sleep transitions when people wake or are falling asleep. Those are the times when people tend to have more seizure activity. And sleep deprivation increases the amount of that time and increases the likelihood that you end up getting a breakthrough, possibly because these periods can be more synchronized. And a classic example of this is seizures during sleep. They tend to occur more often during the NREM, the non-REM periods. That's that slow wave, that deep rhythmic sleep, because the brain's activity is more synchronized and seizures involve synchronized neuronal activity. So losing REM sleep when you're sleep deprived increases the amount of NREM sleep that you have and increases the likelihood of having breakthrough seizures. Headaches, this is pretty straightforward. We know that sleep deprivation is a known trigger for chronic migraineurs and tension headaches. It is something to pay particular attention to. People who have wake-up headaches, headaches in the middle of the night, or a lot worsening headaches in the morning, oftentimes that's a sign of chronic sleep deprivation or sleep apnea. So if you're noticing that, that's one of those things you bring up with your doctor to make sure that you're properly assessed. And the headaches themselves can actually trigger like a feed-forward cycle where your sleep gets further fragmented, and that even makes everything worse. Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, neurodegenerative diseases. So we talked about how the lymphatic system doesn't clear the toxins as well. So the proteins that are associated with that, the amyloid and tau proteins, those actually turn into toxic plaques and tangles that cause neuron damage. And not only is the lymphatic system impaired in chronic sleep deprivation, but sleep deprivation also increases the expression of proteins that helps facilitate the conversion of those toxic proteins into these pathologic forms that actually causes damage. You also see the decrease in ability to clear damage from reactive oxide species. So these are the free radicals that you hear about quite a bit. Lack of sleep reduces the mechanisms by which we can clear that damage and promotes cell death and neuron death, which again facilitates these neurodegenerative diseases. And when it's in particular locations, it can be Alzheimer's. In other locations, it can be Parkinson's. And then lastly, a large area of neurologic disease that's associated with sleep is multiple sclerosis. This is a demyelinating disease. It's where the protective layer around neurons breaks down because of an autoimmune process. And what we see in sleep-deprived patients is that the ability for neurons to create that protective coating goes away, and the cells that actually produce that coating actually fail to regenerate. So in patients who are chronically sleep deprived, you see considerably higher rates of demyelinating disease. And this is kind of really exemplified by the fact that there's a large population study that looked at day shift versus night shift workers, and they found a 20-fold increase in the likelihood of having multiple sclerosis by being a night shift worker, just because of chronic sleep deprivation. So, this is kind of a smattering. This is a large area, but just so that you understand the breadth of the effects of sleep deprivation. I think the take-home points for you are sleep deprivation affects every part of the body. Every single system is affected. The brain in particular, and specifically cognition in the areas of attention, executive function, and memory. These are the areas that are most often abnormal in patients with chronic sleep deprivation. And of course, not only is sleep deprivation associated with worsening of pre-existing neurologic conditions, it is also associated with even facilitating the progression of certain neurodegenerative diseases. All right. And with that, I think we're going to open up to questions.
All right, great. Thanks so much. I'd love to lead a question and answer session, but I think I'm just going to go to bed instead. No. Okay. Our questions sort of fall into two general categories. I just want to put them out there so we have time to cover both of them. One is, how do I know if I have a sleep issue? When should I get a sleep study? How do you know if you have sleep apnea? What are the signs and symptoms of a sleep issue? That's one category. Another category is what sort of medications and sleep aids would you recommend? Is melatonin going to adversely affect my own body's melatonin production? Another question, do sleep needs change as we age? Specifically, do you need less sleep after age 60? So I'm going to put those all out there. I don't know who wants to take what, but I want to make sure we at least address those in part.
So I'm happy to field some of those. The first that I heard from you was, how do you know if you have a sleep disorder? And that's going to be a combination of characteristic historical features, symptoms. So for sleep apnea, for example, we'd expect most typically a history of snoring. It's easier when you have a bed partner who is noticing abnormalities, but some bed partners sleep very heavily, or other times people don't have a bed partner. We would typically be looking for daytime consequences. So if you have excessive sleepiness during the daytime, despite having an adequate duration of sleep at night, that's going to be a reason that you want to investigate further. There are many different things that might contribute to that excess sleepiness, but certainly if you're overweight, have a history of high blood pressure, have a history of snoring, certainly if you have headaches at night or in the morning, as Dr. Misra mentioned, those are things that would prompt further investigation. And the confirmation of sleep apnea is through a sleep study. That can either be a home sleep study, which is looking at your pattern of breathing and oxygenation at home, versus an attended sleep study in a laboratory setting, which is done less often, but collects more information about brain and muscle activity in addition to breathing.
Okay, there was a follow-on question about the Inspire device for sleep apnea.
The Inspire device is a device that is an implanted pacemaker in the chest, much like a cardiac pacemaker. In fact, it is a cardiac pacemaker that was reprogrammed so that rather than stimulating the heart to keep the heart beating regularly, this is a device in the chest that attaches to the hypoglossal nerve in the neck, which stimulates the soft palate and the tongue. And the device senses when you are beginning a breath and sends a signal to those structures to move out of the way when you're breathing in. So you turn on the device before you go to bed, and it's active throughout the night, and then you turn it off in the morning. I don't think the ads do justice to the fact that this is a surgically implanted device. It's not as effective as CPAP. CPAP is a mask that blows in air that keeps these structures open, which is the most effective form of therapy, but also can be obtrusive and can take some getting used to. But the Inspire device is a well-tested device. I think most of us would view that as more of a kind of end of the road or last resort for management of sleep apnea.
All right, thank you. All right, anything on sleep aids?
Complicated topic, yeah. It's
and
again,
also staying asleep once you get to sleep.
Yeah, a lot of it is contingent on what the reason is that sleep is broken up. So you can imagine that take two different people, one of whom has undiagnosed sleep apnea, using a sedative to keep that person asleep when the problem is that they're breathing irregularly and having these almost miniature choking episodes overnight is going to be a distinctly bad idea. Someone else might have fragmentation of sleep because they have significant work-related stress. This can be very hard to see. The stress that we all experience can be hard to see for what it is. I've had loads of patients whose sleep normalized after a change in jobs or after getting out of a relationship that was creating a lot of stress. So it's hard to give a one-size-fits-all answer to whether or not someone should use sleeping pills. If all these things have been addressed and the person is left with sleep that is fragmented and not explained, there are two approaches. One is a variety of different medicines that are available. The other is in clinical trials just as effective as any of the sleeping pills that have been tested, and that's cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Underutilized. It's significantly more work, obviously, than just taking a pill. And then another comment to make about sleeping pills. Most of the over-the-counter sleeping pills are Benadryl in one form or another, antihistamines. So Tylenol PM, Advil PM, Somanex, NyQuil. These are all sedating antihistamines. And, they may work in a pinch to make you drowsier and have you sleep more, but they have consequences. And perhaps Dr. Misra can speak to that. There are statistical correlations between chronic use of medications like Benadryl and dementing illnesses later in life. And whether the drugs are directly responsible or problematic because they are covering up other undiagnosed issues, I think remains to be determined. But in general, I think most of us would not recommend the regular use of sedating medications for sleep, certainly not without seeing a sleep doctor, and in particular, making sure that there's careful attention to the factors that are influencing one's sleep.
Okay. How about requiring less sleep as we get older? Is that a thing?
I think the requirements between early adulthood and later in life are probably very similar. I think that it's harder to get that sleep because we accumulate medical problems, stressors. Life gets a little bit more in the way as most older adults who sleep really well have little to no medical comorbidities, other medical problems. That's very typically the case. So you still need sleep. You still need it. It can be harder to get that sleep, however, as we age.
Yeah, I think that it's one of those myths that kind of gets propagated by the fact that as you get older, it is harder to get that high quality sleep. And you see more and more of your cohort saying the exact same thing. Oh, I wake up 4 or 5 times in the middle of the night to urinate. It's really hard for me to go back to sleep, and it kind of normalizes it. But in actuality, I think the sleep requirements are fairly stable throughout life. It's just that you're not getting it when you're getting older.
Okay. And how about some of the natural remedies to aid sleep, like essential oils or herbs?
These exist in a whole industry of supplements and other materials that are very, very poorly studied. And most likely rely on placebo effect. Now, are essential oils harmful or risky? Almost certainly not. I mean, there are some. If you're using an aromatherapy and you have significant respiratory disease, there may be some sensitivity there, but otherwise, it's hard to imagine any real significant risk given the number of people that are using it and the very few instances of harm or problems. In the very small reports where this helps or that helps, like lavender gets implicated, valerian root gets implicated. These have one, they're not produced in any standardized fashion, nor have they really been subjected to anything that most scientists would consider a fair test. So I think if it's low risk and you play around with something like that, if it works for you as an individual, who cares if it's a placebo effect? If it helps you relax and is part of an unwinding kind of a ritual at the end of the night, that can be very helpful.
I think the same goes for things like CBD and THC oils, which a lot of people do tend to use as sleep aids. And my rule of thumb in general is that I don't recommend them because, like Dr. Guerrero said, there's no strong evidence to support the use of any particular tincture. But there's enough anecdotal evidence on a person-to-person basis that if you find something to be useful, then I'm usually fairly okay with that.
Okay, thank you. We're at the end of our time. I think we've addressed most of the questions that came in some form or another. So I'd like to thank you both on behalf of Newton-Wellesley Hospital, thank our audience, and thank you, Dr. Misrath, Dr. Kadar, for your insight onto sleep. And everyone out there, please keep your eyes open for other future programming from the Community Collaborative. And I hope everyone has a great night's sleep. Thank you.
Thanks so much.